let's now discuss the meeting of the EU leaders in Downing Street in the UK. We are now being joined by Dr. Laskiewicz from London. Let's talk about that now. First, what's your reaction to the pro-Ukraine protests in the US? That's Vermont, where J.D. Vance is visiting for ski holidays. A lot of people feel he added to the row in the Oval Office on Friday. Just briefly in that.
Very quickly, there are some protests, but they are very small and they were not going to lead anywhere. But it is interesting that they occurred at all because they are quite unusual and therefore it should be noted but not made over much of.
Over to the EU summit in the UK, one of a kind in many, many years. I'm sure you agree. So the leaders are in Downing Street with, or were in Downing Street with some who have a very solid relationship with US President Donald Trump in attendance, and expectations are very high. Many have preferred solutions to what they will do or can do. There's been lots of lip service as to what the EU can do. People want to see action put into words, Dr. Marek.
Yes, the whole problem is, though, what action? You see, there are 3 points they have to contend with. Do they have any concrete peace proposals that differ from what's already been said and that would be acceptable also to President Trump and ultimately Russia, as well as, of course, meeting the demands of Ukraine? At present, nothing of this is forthcoming, though we'll see the peace plan when it's drawn up. 2, can they actually defend Ukraine if the USA pulls out? There's a lot of talk about increasing defense spending, but it has been quite minor. And put quite simply, Europe simply does not have the resources to do so, nor the quality of arms. 3, is therefore the Western Europe, going to do anything spectacular as a result of this conference? Myself, I think the most interesting aspect is that they're going back to Trump. Now, this is an important point because what Keir Starmer is doing is trying, as well as Macron, as far as I can see, to keep the communication, the contact alive. And that's very important because the third point is, can the West hold itself together? As it stands, no, but in the sense that it's quite clear there is a split in views between the USA and Europe. But Starmer's view of going there to Trump and discussing it with him is a very good one. And hopefully, at the very least, cordial, warm and helpful relations will continue.
Now, this is also an opportunity for the EU to prove they are important in these conversations after so much anticipation by Zelensky from the EU. Don't you think so?
Yes, you're quite right that the EU would like to be seen as important. But the fact of the matter is, there is no European army. There's no likelihood of one. 2, they simply don't spend enough. 3, even if you've combined all the armies, they're not sufficient really to hold Russia. And so therefore, although the EU wants to strut on the world stage, it is USA, which is the key country. Hence, of all the actions taken, it is Starmer and Macron going to the USA for seeing if there's some joint action possible, which is by far the most important. And unfortunately, the EU is in second place in the pecking order.
Now, Dr. Marek, one would like to see the EU step up defense spending. I know that some of the EU leaders have mentioned that the over-reliance on the US is exceedingly too much. So the leaders have to look for smarter ways to deal with the issue of defense. Don't you think so?
Yes, you're quite right in stating that they should do more. The problem is there's a lot of talk and we have to see the action. Now, let's see the EU spend more. I mean, do it instead of just saying they're going to do it. Because saying they're going to do it, frankly, isn't very important. What they have to do is show. They also have to show that they can improve the quality of their arms, their military. To be honest, even if they spend more, they'd have to spend it in areas which their reliance is almost total on the USA, namely intelligence, especially from space. And therefore, the EU, from this point of view, should really concentrate on the quality and quantity of its military.
Now, this is more like, come to think about it, the EU leaders versus the US. This is not a sort of like a EU against the US issue here. Do you think the EU can raise enough funds to, you know, get into a situation where they can help Ukraine in all of this? I mean, we're talking about just US as against EU leaders from France. We talk about Germany. We talk about a lot. I mean, EU leaders is a combination of the EU itself. So do you think they can raise this fund themselves to be able to back Ukraine?
No, I do not believe that's possible in the short term, certainly. It's even dubious in the medium term. To be quite honest, Europe simply isn't in America's league in that respect. What is important, though, and this is important, is the EU on the whole, because obviously there's Hungary, all about, on the whole, the EU is supporting Zelensky, wants to carry on supporting him. And that, I think, is an important aspect. I would also like to point out that the fact that this talk about not relying on the USA too much, it's the sort of talk which, because they can't back it up, it just serves to irritate, I think. However, what is important is the following. Every time the EU says it ups its spending so it can try and hold Ukraine by itself, this is what President Trump wanted. Therefore, this conference today is what President Trump wanted. He wants Europe to support Ukraine, and the USA does not have to spend money or its blood defending Ukraine. So from that point of view, actually today's conference, far from being the EU anti-USA, is actually the EU putting into practice President Trump's wishes.
Now, is this an issue of lack of political will when we talk about resources, gathering resources from the EU? Is it lack of political will to help Ukraine, or what is it about?
One of the problems isn't so much lack of will, though that exists. It isn't even so much about lack of money. It's something else altogether. The USA is one gigantic country. It has got a lot of money to spend by a single government, that's Washington, and a single military, the Pentagon. Not so in EU. There are loads of pentagons, so to speak, and loads of governments, and trying to coordinate anything, including developing the arms which would match the Americans, is virtually impossible in this. Just England, Germany, and France together, when they develop arms, make it sound like a major feat. There are a handful of examples which worked, and in reality, USA does that virtually every day because it is, so to speak, a gigantic EU, but one which is working with cohesion now for some centuries and is simply a different league to the EU, which, please remember, spends a lot of time bickering and arguing as well.
Now, this takes me back to what Zelensky said about an EU army. I know you've mentioned that in the course of your explanation. But should the EU begin to look at forming its army for the future?
The EU has considered this over the years, and it has simply rejected it because ultimately there is no EU in the sense of the United States of America with Washington and the Pentagon. There is a set of nations which more or less agree on things more or less altogether, and that's just not possible, therefore, to form a European army along those lines. Moreover, there are countries like Great Britain who are utterly against this because they see it would weaken NATO. And if you remember perhaps, the goal of NATO was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. That was the Lord Carrington's quote. And the point about it is, if the EU does form its own army, in effect, it displaces NATO. And that is Great Britain's greatest fear, because they still see that without the USA, certainly in the short run, arguably also in the middle term, it just can't work. And so therefore, all these points have to be borne in mind.
Now, Keir Starmer has listed 4 steps to help Ukraine. Let me talk about that before we go. To keep military aid flowing into Ukraine while the war is ongoing and to increase economic pressure on Russia. Also, any lasting peace must ensure Ukraine's sovereignty and security, and Ukraine must be at the table for any peace talks. In the event of a peace deal, European leaders will aim to determine any future invasion by Russia into Ukraine. Also, there would be a coalition of the willing to defend Ukraine and guarantee peace talks in the country. Are these ambitious?
They're like pious hopes, to be quite honest. They're not just merely ambitious. The real problem is he said nothing there which he hasn't said before. Keep aid flowing. Well, of course, they've been doing that for 3 years. And Obviously, they want to carry on doing it because Europe wants to do that. As for securing a peace deal with Europe and Ukraine at the table, well, the problem is that it's really USA and Russia which are doing the most, if you like, the most talking at present. And Trump has made it quite clear he can do that all by himself and then bring in Ukraine when the, so to speak, the groundwork has been done, possibly also the Europeans, especially if they lend a hand or are prepared to do the peacekeeping. However, as for the rest, the just peace, the business about how can I put, making sure that if you Putin and Russia never attack again, these are virtually a pie in the sky because Russia's made it quite clear what its peace terms are, and they do not involve the surrender of any territory that they've occupied. Ukraine has made it quite clear what its peace terms are. It wants the Russians off its former territory, and there's no middle ground here, and there's never been any suggestion of it. And that therefore, as a result, it's not going to happen. And please note that the three nations, the UK, which is now holding this summit, the USA, and Russia have already given Ukraine guarantees in 1994. And then when it happened, when push came to shove, there was no push from or counter push, if you like, from the side of the UK or the USA when Russia actually invaded. So this business of guarantees, which occupies a great deal of media time and political time, is actually just pious hopes when it comes down to it. Because unless you're determined to stop Russia, then all these words mean nothing.
All right, very interesting there. Thank you so much, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz, for making out time to be on Arise America.